UFC 291 features the return of the BMF title, and there's a lot of debate around it, of course, as same as there was last time when it was created for UFC 244 back in 2019. I'm going to talk a little bit about the BMF as a whole and break down, I think, what the key kind of questions are and give you my thoughts on them. As always, let me know your thoughts in the comments below because I know this is a divisive topic, but let me talk about my initial kind of impressions of the BMF belt and how I feel about it as a whole. I think I'm a little bit 50-50 in between the two camps. I don't see a lot of people saying that they're big fans of it, but I'm sure there are people that are. As a concept, I feel like this might just be because the people who are the loudest to see on social media tend to be like the hardcore fans and the people that watch every MMA show and stuff like that. They tend to be more against it, at least from what I've told, at least from the impression I've got, and people who maybe tune into MMA events, like the big UFC pay-per-views, kind of less frequently, the big names and stuff like that, they might kind of prefer it, I would imagine, is kind of the general consensus. And we'll get into maybe why that is and things like that. Like I said, I think I'm a bit 50-50 on it. And we'll get into that with what I think are kind of the three big questions around the BMF belt. Before I get into those, I want to point out the kind of a thing to bear in mind. I think Dustin Poirier versus Justin Gaethje 2 is one of the best fights you could possibly book in the UFC right now. If you asked me to build a dream card of fights that you could make right now, it would be on there. The only difficult thing is it needs to be 5 rounds, which again we'll get to, but you can't have that as a 3-round fight. You're just wasting that fight, in my opinion. So this isn't anything to do with the stock, the excitement levels for this fight. If anything, I think the argument that I will make is that this fight is so good it probably doesn't need it for a lot of people, because man, if you go back and watch that first fight, it is absolutely ridiculous. I went and did that on the UFC Fight Flashback series on UFC Fight Pass, which is something I haven't really dived into, but I would really recommend if you do have UFC Fight Pass. Just kind of like you get the fights, but they're kind of like more highlight versions from different angles as opposed to the standard angles that you see, and then gives you a little bit of the build-up, a little bit of the aftermath and stuff like that. So it's a cool way to revisit some great fights in about 20 minutes or so. And I would highly recommend doing it for Dustin Poirier, Justin Gaethje, because the fight itself is good enough. In fact, just go back and watch that fight. Insanely, that fight is from 2018, which is mental to me. If you'd asked me when Justin Gaethje debuted in the UFC, I probably would have told you it was 2018. But no, he fought Dustin Poirier in a main event. If you want to put into perspective how long ago that is, Israel Adesanya fought Marvin Vettori on that card for the first time. That's mad. Anyway. The first question, I think, is, does the BMF need to exist? Personally, I didn't have an issue with it the first time around when Jorge Masvidal and Nate Diaz met at the main event at Madison Square Garden. I thought that the call-out from Nate Diaz was brilliant, and it kind of, they set the whole fight up off of that, right? Then you got the BMF belt because of it. Do I think the BMF belt needed to be a real thing? Probably not. I thought that it was a cool idea, like selling the fight as that, but I don't know if it needed to be a real belt. And the reason for that is I don't think, sure, maybe the fact of the matter is it got way more attention on social media than if you just announced Jorge Masvidal is fighting Nate Diaz in the main event. It's going to be a big deal anyway, but the BMF belt was kind of the big talking point in a way. So it worked for the UFC, I think, massively. Having The Rock there, all that stuff, felt unnecessary, but I think it probably did contribute to that fight being such a big deal. Especially when you consider, well, I mean, Jorge Masvidal is retired and Nate Diaz is not in the UFC anymore. So that's pretty crazy because it was only, well, 3 and a bit years ago. 4. Jesus. All right, that is quite a long time. So I don't have a problem with it existing. The issue with it is you knew it was probably not going to be defended. And so in that case, I think it feels a little bit too much like a gimmick, which it is. But Dana doesn't do gimmick fights. You have to keep that in mind this whole time. Second big question is, did the pay-per-view need it? And this is kind of a bigger question of, does every pay-per-view main event need to be a title fight? It leads very nicely into the next question, so I won't go too deep. But the fact of the matter is, we don't see UFC pay-per-view main events that don't have titles attached. Usually it is because Conor McGregor is fighting and there's no other reason for it not being a title fight. I believe, I could be wrong, but the Madison Square Garden card, I think they were targeting John Jones' return for that card. And then, obviously, it didn't happen. Or maybe it was somebody else. Maybe, yeah, it could have been somebody else. But they were targeting a title fight for that, regardless. And then it didn't happen. And so the BMF belt, I think, to me, that was the big thing where it felt like a gimmick, is because it felt like it was only there so that fight could headline. And I know it's a weird thing to say now, but I think at the time, Nate Diaz versus Jorge Masvidal didn't need it. It was a big enough fight as it was, especially after Diaz's call out and Masvidal's reaction, which was fantastic. And like I said, that leads into the third question, which is, does this pay-per-view need it? Because I would say, if you asked a general a fan that watches most UFC cards, maybe not some of the Apex ones, but I wouldn't say I blame them. Slight dig. Poirier versus Gaethje 2 is a must-watch fight. I think if you put that on at the same time as Nate Diaz and Jorge Masvidal, was in the one that we got, not right now, but back when there was hype for that, I think hardcore fans would pick Gaethje Poirier. I could be wrong. But to the fan base that I mentioned earlier that maybe tune in to watch a John Jones card, they might tune in. Obviously, they're going to tune in to watch a Conor card. They might tune in to watch the occasional Izzy card. Things like that, you know, the big, maybe 3 or 4 pay-per-views a year, the big kind of tentpole ones, International Fight Week maybe, the card at the end of the year, which is usually a big one, things like that, right? A heavyweight title fight, something like that. I think they would probably, if they'd seen Poirier Gaethje 1, they would pick Poirier Gaethje 2, right? But if they hadn't, I think they would probably go with Nate Diaz and Jorge Masvidal. So if that needed the BMF belt, does Poirier Gaethje? And I just don't know, because I think that I would be interested, actually, to ask. I have some friends that don't always tune into every card, but, you know, the big names, a Nate Diaz fight, they go, oh, Nate Diaz is fine. I love Nate Diaz. Great. Justin Gaethje, I think, doesn't have the same name value. Of course, he doesn't have a win over Conor McGregor. He isn't this larger-than-life personality. But I think he has the same reputation at this point for, if Justin Gaethje's fighting, you know that it's going to be great. So if you are, like, somewhat an MMA fan, you will watch it, even if you just catch up on the highlights, right? Which is basically the whole fight, let's be honest. So I would be interested to ask those kind of people whether Dustin Poirier, Justin Gaethje 2 is enough in America to buy the pay-per-view, or if you're in the UK to stay up until 5 a.m. in the morning to watch it, right? Because I feel like it is, but when I think about it, do Poirier and Gaethje have the names, the kind of the social media, I don't want to say scale, but like the viral clips, right? Jorge became a huge star because of that, and Nate Diaz has always been a huge star because of that, and just the general reputation of the Diaz brothers, I suppose. So, are they big enough names without needing it? If we're being honest, it really doesn't matter, because the UFC are not going to put a main event on without it being a title fight, and that is why this is here. And I love the fact that this is 5 rounds, of course, and I think that this fight is too big to be a fight night, if that makes sense, because of how good the first one was. It feels more important. I think you could probably, I guess you could do it as a co-main 5-rounder. They've done a few of those lately, but to me personally, this fight doesn't need it. I don't know who would see an advert for this, like the promo on social media or something, and go, I'm not really sure, I don't think I'm going to watch that one. But you add the BMF belt, which they've already experienced once, like they know the whole thing at the BMF belt. It doesn't feel as like, it doesn't feel as fun and as on the spot as it did last time. I don't know who sees that and goes, oh, it's for the BMF belt, I'm in. Like I said, I'd be interested to know people's thoughts on that, so do let me know. But I think we need to get to a stage where there are non-title fight pay-per-views. because I think fights like Justin Gaethje versus Dustin Poirier 2 do not need a title, and they need to be a main event. And I think people would pay pay-per-view price for it. But again, do they have big enough names, I guess, is the issue. Like, I'm trying to think of an example of if somebody came back. Let's say Brock Lesnar came back and he doesn't fight for the heavyweight title. It's just a main event against a heavyweight contender. Of course that's pay-per-view. Of course they probably put an interim belt on it, if we're being honest, or you just go straight in to fight John Jones or whoever is the champ. But for the purposes of this argument, right, he's a name that's big enough to where he doesn't need a title, and he's not going to fight on anything other than pay-per-view. I just don't think it needs it. To sum up, I don't think it needs it. However, if it does more numbers for Justin Gaethje and it does more numbers for Dustin Poirier, increases the social media numbers by even the smallest amount, then who really cares? And both guys are obviously incredibly deserving of that status if you are going to give them it. And I can't wait for the fight. So I'm really complaining about something that isn't that important because personally, I'm probably just going to ignore all the BMF stuff and just enjoy the fight. I feel like both guys have kind of already stated that, like, it's a cool thing to have, but which I feel like is a lot of people's reaction to the BMF belt the first time around is like, yeah, it'd be cool to put, in the trophy cabinet, but, it's not a real belt. But yeah, let me know you guys' thoughts on the BMF title fight. Would you buy Justin Gaethje versus Dustin Poirier 2 if it had no belt attached? I don't think there's much of a debate there, but hey, you never know. Like I said, I'd be interested to find out. Enjoy the fights, and I will catch you on the next video.